Everyone from the room is here.
A few people still over there. Yeah. If you want to.
Are you going to start recording or when you are recording?
I did.
You are closing the recording? Okay.
Is it on?
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second Geospatial Forum of our center for this fall. For those of you that do not know me, I'm Ferrer Baran. I am a faculty fellow here in the Center for Geospatial Analytics, as well as an affiliated faculty with College of Design's PhD program. It is great pleasure and honor to introduce to you today my two colleagues from College of Design, Professors Sara Quinn and Tania Allen. Sara Quinn is an associate professor at the School of Architecture, teaching a range of undergraduate and graduate studios, as well as advanced graduate research seminars. Sara was honored as the 2017 Emerging Professional by the North Carolina AIA chapter for her extraordinary accomplishments in architectural design, design discourse, architectural education, and mentoring of the next generation of architects. Sara received her Bachelor of Environmental Design in Architectural degree from NC State and graduated with distinction in earning her Master in Architecture from the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University. Sara's ongoing research investigates infrastructural networks through mapping methodologies with the goal of facilitating deeper, more diverse understanding of urban systems and the processes which shape physical place, cultural space, and social territory. Tania Allen is an associate professor of art and design and director of graduate programs in art and design. Tania received her BA in history from Washington University in St. Louis, a pre-graduate certificate in visual communication from the School of Art Institute of Chicago, and a Master of Graphic Design from NC State. Her background in history, fine arts, and graphic design shape her research and practice through using visualization as a tool by which to question historical and contemporary assumptions and knowledge. Through her practice, Tania has specifically focused on design as a catalyst for community engagement, using it as a participatory and co-creative process that helps community members take ownership of core social issues and work to make change from the ground up. Jointly, Sara and Tania are the co-directors of the design research group CoLab, which focuses on critical mapping as a participatory design research tool. Currently, CoLab's focus is on developing a methodology for critical mapping that simultaneously embraces cartography as a powerful analytic and synthetic research tool, while also challenging the assumptions that the mapping and visualization process embeds within it. Without further ado, let's move to the lecture. Thanks, Sara and Tania, for being here with us. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thanks for being here with us today. As Dr. Baran mentioned, my name is Tania Allen. Sara and I had the opportunity to speak with some of you yesterday in the Lunch and Learn, and thank you for coming back again today. So that was a very great introduction. Thank you so much, Ferber. So as Dr. Baran mentioned, Sara and I are the co-directors of CoLab, and really the core of our work is embedded within this faculty initiative, which is, while not a formal laboratory, we sort of operate as one. That we established in 2012 for the purpose of exploring ways that we can use mapping as a synthetic, analytical, and formative research tool in design and planning. As a graphic designer, as Dr. Baran mentioned, with a background in history, I'm really interested in the ways that design acts as a rhetorical device, persuading users or consumers of a truth that it engenders. I'm also incredibly interested in the way that mapping and data visualization also act as persuasive mediums to communicate complexity through the inclusion and exclusion of information. Sarah's an architect. I'll let you.
As an architect, I'm really interested in site, place, and how the language of building and materials can echo cultural heritage.
Some of our earliest projects were conceived of as large-scale public and participatory mapping projects, where the map itself was used as an informal data collection and/or survey instrument. And I say informal because we did not do IRB or any of that kind of stuff when we were doing these. In one of our first projects, we created a large-scale neighborhood map in downtown Raleigh as part of SparkCon, and actually did this a number of times over the years, where we were looking at collecting different types of information. So in this case, really what public space meant to people through the memories and experiences that they've had. We've also done projects that are, with the AIA, looking at how transportation systems and routes that people take every day line up with the policies and the proposals that the city is putting forth. We've led workshops and projects that use different types of mapping and visualization, so non-geospatial, as more structured tools for imagining, planning, and facilitating different types of conversations. In this case, imagining a food studies system, or food studies program, excuse me, at NC State. And we've also run a course called DIY Cartography, which we're going to talk a lot about today, the most recent iteration of that. Which has had many iterations, but most or all of them include some examination of equity in the built environment, specifically related to urban development. We use the activity of mapping and the artifact of the map to challenge our assumptions and the conclusions that we draw in the research process, and to ask, why is that so? To dig deeper into what is behind visual and spatial phenomenon. We've exhibited our work and the work from the class around Raleigh. This is a picture of an exhibit that we put up at the City of Raleigh Museum a number of years ago, and other parts of the country, where not only are we sort of displaying the maps from the course and some of our other research, but we're also asking people to participate in creating maps around what the city and their experience within the city is to them, or means to them. And together and individually, we've written and contributed to a number of books. Most recently, the book Empty Pedestals, which is not here because it's still in production, which is looking, the Empty Pedestals book is looking at the Confederacy and Confederate memorialization in relation to the landscapes they inhabit. And the DIY Cartography book and the Connecting the Dots book are self-published, that are really a compilation of and an explanation of the course and the maps that students presented as a result. And because we're designers and visualizers, we always try to sort of make sense of our work and positionality through some sort of process of visualization or diagramming. So this sort of gets it, I think, hopefully, although there's a lot there, the heart of what we consider are the key aspects of map making and reading for us, especially as a research tool. So this continual process of sort of encoding and decoding that goes into the creation, and the subsequent interpretations and questions that come out really throughout the process, whether you're making or reading. So these are the assumptions driving the larger questions, or maybe smaller, more specific questions, of how we can develop a pedagogical tool or approach for using the activity of mapping to make more thoughtful, deliberate, and inclusive design proposals for intervening in the built environment. We've begun much of this work mapping sort of the observable elements of hostility in the built environment. So here, you've probably seen a lot of these examples, window spikes that prevent people from sitting and or sleeping in public space. Monuments celebrating chapters in our history, and obviously this is a very big conversation that's been happening over the last couple of years, that on their surface can be described as markers of heritage or history, and suggesting that these histories are neutral. That's been a huge coded sort of argument, while at the same time giving authority to one perspective or side of a shared history, which really just got us more overtly thinking about how these can be inviting to some and hostile to others. And more recently, we're focusing on how systems of oppression that often involve race, gender, and other forms of marginalization impact disinvestment, poverty, and racial segregation over generations. And then how this disinvestment contributes to vulnerability in our neighborhoods, of the same neighborhoods, which then creates conditions for rapid gentrification and increased displacement. And obviously in Raleigh, with its really rapid urbanization, this is a huge conversation that's happening now. The more that we've done this work, the more and more we've shifted to mapping or to sort of encouraging our students, and also for us mapping the underlying systems that are causing these inequities. In design fields, like many professional fields on this primarily white institutional campus, we find that those studying and leading do not always represent the diversity of the populations they serve. And this underrepresentation has huge ramifications in perpetuating racism across fields. We see this historically and contemporarily, and especially in fields tasked with the design and planning of the built environment. And Here Comes Everyman, which was the proceedings of the 1971 Design Research Society Conference. Nigel Cross, who is instrumental in sort of thinking about design process and design thinking, called for designers to involve users in an explicit partnership in the design process, arguing for a change in the handing down of policies and designs to users who had little to no say in the plan that subsequently dictated their lives. Every development, Cross argued, seems to hold as many threats of harmful side effects as it holds promises for the enhancement of society. One of the questions that we ask ourselves constantly is how can we engage people in critical discussions and critical reflection about the role of design in creating these preferred conditions that Victor Papanak defines. For the designers, this means raising questions about how we engage people in research and how we evaluate our own methods, perspectives and biases that we bring to the design process. And for users and citizens, this might mean encouraging critical reflection and discourse surrounding that same design process. And as we gain more and more access to data information, oftentimes, as Manuel Lima argues, this access is far easier than our capacity to understand it. So we're seeking and defining, hopefully, visualization strategies that help us make meaning while simultaneously acknowledging that the data itself is biased and there are multiple meanings that the visualization can hold. We primarily use ArcGIS and QGIS as data processing tools, but then we spend a lot of time in post-processing with our students using Illustrator, things like RAWGraphs, which is also sort of data processing, and Tableau, to really encourage iteration and exploration into the ways that different visualized forms impact the legibility and interpretation of the data itself. And as we get into specific student projects, we can talk a little bit more about the data sets and tools we're using. Like many fields, often in design research, we focus on the visible, the observable, and the quantitative. The flows of traffic, the proximity to other built environment features and programmatic assets, and traces of historical use and reuse. But our question is what happens when we expand the data, the tools, and the methods we use to visualize place and community? We think it helps us transition from thinking about site as a static parcel with a set of property boundaries, which primarily consider the physical, observable elements inside that line or adjacent to it. To understand site as a dynamic set of conditions and interconnected forces, some physical, some ecological, some sociocultural, some political, some economic, some climatic, some geographical, etc. And in order to measure and understand these diverse systems and forces, we must look to diverse data sets and sources. Some of these are going to be our tried and true geospatial built environment data sets, census-based demographic data sets, wind roses, soil maps. But we think that in order to be more conscious, we need to also consider more fully the qualitative, experiential, archival, and personal data points in comparison of geospatial, to seek out and to try to understand the layers of complex relationships that might be pressing against a particular site and how people are experiencing it. So this is a geospatial forum, so I don't really have to convince you of the value of mapping, but we'll explain a little bit, I think, how we think about its importance and maybe be able to sort of have a discussion about how it's similar or different to the way you all think about it. So how can mapping be used to expand these measures of place and engage a wider audience to participate in the design process, particularly and hopefully in things like site analysis, planning, and programming, with the aims of ultimately creating a more equitable built environment. So obviously one of the most powerful aspects of mapping is that it can make the abstract concrete. It can help us make sense of dynamic cycles, to pull apart pieces and see it as a sequence rather than a whole or a static piece of information. For example, in these maps by James Corner, we can start to examine the temporal, daily, and yearly cycles of the sun to unpack the relationships of daily ritual, space planning, and community programming. We think, we think about the power of maps not just as a means by which to communicate a reality, but also, as Corner argues, to engender the reshaping of the worlds in which people live. We think by reframing it as such, it better acknowledges the unique responsibility that we have as designers to think about the work that we do in more sobering terms. So we use this well-known Hobo-Dyer equal area projection map as an instrument to challenge what is real and what is accurate by projecting an alternate reality of the distribution of space and political boundaries. So, South, I'm sure we've all talked about this, South being up, South being up and North being down, sort of flips the standard, and that standard is not an accident, nor is it arbitrary. The reprojection raises important questions about what importance and power we place on the size, centrality, and orientation of the placement of continents and land masses. It also forces a recognition of the arbitrary significance and hierarchy we place on the northern and southern hemispheres and the social, economic, and political power relationships between the two. And really for designers, these are conversations that we don't have very often. So that's probably very central to a lot of the conversations that you have in this department, but it's not so much for us in design. But even as we understand the map as a construct of reality and a tool of power, it also holds an incredible amount of power as a learning tool and a visual roadmap that, as Novak and Gowan state in Learning How to Learn, can show us some of the pathways we might take to connect meanings to concepts. In other words, it can help us externalize what we know and examine what we don't know. In this vein, mapping is part of a longer legacy within architecture and design, used as a means by which to study and understand place, such as in Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown's Learning from Las Vegas, which in many ways reconsiders the way that we understand visual and verbal vernacular through the study of typology, topography, and symbolism. And we think it's an important paradigm shift within this work to consider the root of our association with the data that underlies the activity of mapping. The designer and historian Joanna Drucker has argued that what is inherent in the semantics of data is that information is given to us, which implies some inherent truth that's embedded within it. But by redescribing it as CAPTA, we include a paradigm in which interpretation, context, dialogue, and discourse become more integrated. In this map by Paul Butler, we see here a series of Facebook connections. And when we show this map to our students, oftentimes we also start to see other truths in it, such as where there are people, where there is infrastructure, Wi-Fi, internet, electricity, social media. We start to see these as active places and the others as voids. These are also things that we are taking from the map, but often we see it as things that the map is giving to us, which we think works to absolve us oftentimes of the responsibility of how our interpretation impacts the decisions that ultimately are made as a result of the map. And so we like to compare that original one to sort of a cartographic response that Thorsten Gatz made to the original Facebook map. So in his rebuttal, he mapped population density, the red masses, indicating over 2 persons per square mile. And he also overlaid alternative social media platforms that people in those areas were using. So the comparison of these maps and the meanings decoded or taken from the maps highlight the difference between what the data, what is given, and the CAPTA, what is taken. And now we're going to unpack one of our current projects, and that's related to the class that we teach. So I will hand it over to Sarah to do that.
Okay. So as Tania has done a great job introducing our interest in the map, our interest in looking at measures of place as designers. Through our class, we kept teaching, so we've taught DIY cartography about 5 or 6 times, and we were talking about the role of history in the built environment. We were talking about how to look at the city in different lenses, and we kept skirting around the idea, or race kept rising up as something that structures how we interact, structures our history. And so this last semester, we really critically wanted to zoom in. What is the role of histories in imagining our futures? And how can public space and the histories embedded within it commemorate them as acts of oppression or hostile agents? So Tania and I, and many of the students in our class have the privilege of often ignoring many of these symbols, especially the symbols of the Confederacy, sort of seeing them, but not having to deal with their message or their impression. And this year, we really wanted to tackle head on, what is this? What's going on? How does it affect public space? Because we are educating students who are dealing with public space. And in doing this, as Tania was outlining in this 4 aspects of the mapping, we're really looking at mapping as a critical research tool in design. And we're oscillating between understanding map as truth and understanding map as a construct. So dealing with cartography, documentation, data collection, having rigor within that, understanding how the map can visualize real things in the real world, but also understanding the bias within that data and understanding the responsibility of the visual arguments that we're making as we isolate information which is inherent in the map. And on this topic, the Southern Poverty Law Center in 2019 started compiling, it's an open source data set that's being updated. It's called Whose Heritage, and it's all the memorialization of the Confederacy in the United States. And it doesn't just include monuments, which is what we usually think about, but it includes building names, street names, logos, the emblems that are on police uniforms, songs, all of these things. You could throw a rock and hit 10 things just around us that memorialize the Confederacy. It's not just monuments. And they've made this point data so that we started with this data set is one overt symbol of racism in the built environment. And we ask all students to work with this data to start. So we began just looking at the patterns within the data itself. Here, the blue dots are all the live monuments that are standing. The yellow dots that are an outline are removed, and the lighter hatches are ones that are pending removal. And so you can see that Confederate memorials aren't just in the Confederate States. You can start to see patterns of where there's density of removal versus where there's not removal. We broke them down then by type. So these are 4 out of maybe a dozen different types that the Southern Poverty Law Center categorizes. And you can see more monuments as forms of memorialization in counties, but you can also see more monuments are being removed. The yellow ones are the removal. That makes sense. It's semi-easy to take down a monument. It's pretty hard to rename a county, right? But it also reinforces the symbols that we're aware of, and I think exposes the symbols that we're not so aware of, that we're not tackling too. Then when you overlay the monuments, again, the blue are the ones standing, the yellow's removed, with infrastructures of urbanization. These starbursts are international airports, the network are our roads. You start to see that removal is happening in urban centers, urbanized areas. So pointing out the rural-urban political divide that we all know so well in our country, but that most of the removal of monuments is happening along a major highway network, especially along the I-85 and I-95 corridor. There are very few monuments. There's a couple, you can find a couple that have been removed, but very few that are not along one of those infrastructural corridors. who also, still looking at that Southern Poverty Law Center data set in isolation, wanted to take and not just look at it in space, but also look at it in time and see what are the patterns that we begin to see in time. And over here in the far zone over here, that's the Civil War is right here. So it's about, there's incremental monument erection through the 40 or 50 years after the war, but it really wasn't until the early 1900s we really start to see the Confederate memorialized. It wasn't right after the war, a couple generations later. That some people might say, oh, well, Confederacy, they lost the war, got to get their act together, gather their money, be able to celebrate. But that's also the time when Jim Crow legislation was at its height. It's when racial terror was at its height with the red shirts, with the KKK. It's also the concerted effort of promoting the lost narrative, sort of this war of Northern aggression, rewriting of the textbooks, the rise of historical societies. These are all working together in conjunction with these overt symbols in the built landscape. Then you obviously see a decline that's happening as we join World War I, and then a sustained sort of medium amount, again, a huge drop at World War II, back to a sustained investment. Again, this is civil rights. So we see a bump again of the erection of these monuments in reaction to the civil rights movement, which I think is also interesting. When many people think of these monuments, they think they happened a long time ago, but they've been continually erected until sort of the last few years. Then we can also look at when they've been removed. So the orange or the yellow arcs are removal. So they're starting in where they were erected, and the ones that have been removed, the end of the arc is when they're being removed. So what do you see? Yeah. What do you think is happening? Do you have any guesses? What's that? The World Trade Center attack? Good guess. 2015.
The recession from like the housing crisis, but also moving into the Black Lives Matter movement.
That's a great point. Ben Coleman, one of our Masters of Architecture students, he dug into that. He saw that pattern. He was like, what is this? And there are three very tragic events that most of the momentum behind monument removal can be traced to. The first one was the massacre in Charleston, South Carolina, where 9 church members were murdered. The second one was the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville that was protesting a monument that was removed in reaction to the Charleston massacre. And then George Floyd's murder in 2020. And each of these tragic events sort of galvanized. And I think there were, got the numbers right here. After the Charleston massacre, there were 31 Confederate monuments that were removed in reaction to it. After Charlottesville, there were 120 Confederate monuments removed. And after George Floyd's murder, there have been 250 monuments removed afterwards, and really sort of galvanizing the Black Lives Matter behind removing these symbols. So in this class, we wanted to not just look at Confederate memorials. They are one overt thing that we can grab. It was a data set that was really easily accessible for all of us to look at. We wanted to look at how these relate to many other underlying systems, as Tania was talking about earlier. So we scaffold a series of projects in our class to look at different map types, different data types, different research methods as a comparative structure to understand the role of the map and also to build deep narratives within our research. So the first set of maps were primarily spatial maps. And we were really interested in the scale, isolation, and overlay, those sort of tactics of the map. And the second map, we used primarily
relational or networks maps, non-geospatial maps, to look at orientation and hierarchy as a tool of the map. And then the third really sort of formative piece was to create an exhibition that the students curated and created the sort of how they wanted you to navigate their research. So to break out the structures of the projects, we started with 4 geospatial maps that looked at the same system and the same data across 4 different scales. So to go back, start at the smallest scale, Raleigh's city limits. Sophia here was looking at median family income. And so that's what you see in the yellow. The darkest yellow are the highest median family incomes. The lowest, or the closest to white is the lowest. And you can see within Raleigh that the wealthier neighborhoods are to the north and to the west. You can also see those dotted lines are different moments, different boundaries of the city of Raleigh over time. So the historic 1 mile by 1 mile city, and then the growth of Raleigh in the 20s, that's sort of the boundary in 1920, really grew to the northwest. That was so that it could annex these wealthy neighborhoods. Up Glenwood was our furthest extension of the trolley line, and following the trolley line was electricity. Those went hand in hand, which came the better, newer schools, white schools, right? So there's a clear annexation of certain communities and not of other communities over time. Looking at that same median family income now at a different scale, looking at across the state, you can start to see a pattern of the urban crescent from the triangle to Charlotte with higher incomes. And what data set she added here are the improvement zones, opportunity zones, which are tax incentives for redevelopment. She was really interested in gentrification and redevelopment and the role of financial policy in perpetuating gentrification. Then she was looking at the yellow is still median family income at the scale of what's highlighted here are all the states with Jim Crow legislation on the left and United States on the right. One thing I think is interesting, you start to see here, see how the higher median family income again follows those infrastructural corridors. Not a surprise of that, but I didn't realize it would be so overt. There's also where in our country we have concentrated wealth and where we do not. And then the gray dots here are percent Black population overlaid with median family income. Again, interesting patterns starting to emerge. So we asked students in this first series to look at one data set at different scales, overlay it with additional data sets just to see what patterns emerge. We're looking at the data, we're asking questions, and we're using the map to facilitate that. So the map is not an externalizing tool for finding something and then trying to get it out in the world, but really to discover things. Then we asked the students to take that information and to create a relational map, a non-geospatial map, and to give us a case study that explores that pattern in more detail. So here we've got South Park, Raleigh. Sophia was looking at South Park, Raleigh. She was looking at how much of the neighborhood had been reconstructed with new construction. So this is just east of downtown. And over the decades, about 300 new homes happened over the last 60 or 70 years. And there have been over 1,400 new homes in the last 10 years. So it's a rapid redevelopment of this neighborhood. This is a neighborhood that, while there are no redlining maps of Raleigh, probably with lending practices has been purposely depressed in terms of its value. And now developers are reaping that gentrification reward. And then she was looking at how that happens in other cities. So median white income, median white family income versus median non-white family incomes. And you can see that for the 15 fastest growing cities, a real discrepancy there. So then the final assignment in the class was to take their research that they had done individually and figure out how did it relate to one another? How could they start to build larger understandings of different infrastructures? So they started to group themselves around economic systems, around toxic ecologies, around systems of injustice, and infrastructures of resistance. So I'm going to show you a couple more student projects to give you sort of an example of the breadth of things that students studied. Ariel was really interested in how and why memorials became a big thing across the South. And so she started looking at their first place that they were installed, and that was cemeteries, because they were memorializing the dead. So for the first 40 or 50 years, most Confederate memorials were erected in cemeteries, in church lands, private lands, mostly by women's church groups. And then again, around the turn of the century, we start to see those being pulled out into public spaces. So she was trying to understand what was going on there, who was leading that effort, and found that almost all of them were tied to aristocrat women's groups. One of the primary being the United Daughters of Confederacy. So in her timeline here on the left, all the green memorials are ones that can be credited to the UDC. Pretty remarkable that one group sort of erected that many of them. She also looked at other heritages, like on the left, the celebration of Decoration Day versus the National Memorial Day. So the green states, South Carolina, those are ones that still have Decoration Day as a state holiday, celebration of the Civil War rather than our other collective wars. And then the states in the medium green are ones who have recently taken it off the books, and the other ones culturally celebrate that. So she was looking at all these different aspects of celebrating the Confederacy, sort of a social history way. Another student, Britt, she was really interested in toxic ecologies and how the production of coal power actually is a burden on certain communities more so than other communities. So she started looking at literally where is coal extracted, how is it processed, and then what do we do with the waste afterwards that's stored in these coal ash ponds. She looked at it at the scale of the country. So these are different watersheds across our country, and they're color-coded for the number of ash ponds that they hold within that watershed. So the darker ones hold the largest number of coal ash ponds. And you see a scattering, except way over here on the West Coast, a scattering of coal power plants, but you see a real concentration in watersheds of the storage of the waste. And she was really interested in how the proximity of these coal ash ponds to communities of color. So 6 out of 10 coal ash ponds are within 2 miles of a community of color. And she was starting to highlight really large spills that had happened in North Carolina that had polluted the groundwater. And many of those pollutants can last thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And she was really looking at what diseases these contribute to, and then the proportion of those diseases in different demographics. Some of our students also looked at economic systems and their relationship overlaid with the Confederate memorials. So Michaela here, she was looking at historic rates of Black home ownership. So the darker yellow is higher rates of Black home ownership in 1930 on the left. And then she was looking at contemporary data on the right. There's a striking correlation between, especially in sort of the deep South, where the memorials are, and lower rates of Black home ownership. She's also looking at that at the scale of the state, highlighting counties. And then she found this really interesting moment. She was looking at Wilmington, and of course, downtown Wilmington has their Confederate memorials. And then she found these suburban neighborhood with just a cluster of them. What is going on there? She zoomed in, and they were all names of streets. So this 2 suburban neighborhoods, most of their street names were after generals in the Civil War. But you see a strong infrastructural divide between a neighborhood with high Black home ownership and high white home ownership. So black and white neighborhood. But still the black neighborhood had quite a few names of generals of, so there's this ubiquitous celebration regardless of the neighborhood that it's in. And then her non-geospatial map, she was really interested in how the federal government has played a strong role in creating this wealth gap through home ownership over time. And so this is a circular timeline looking at, and all the points that she's called out are different federal housing policies. The light gray ones are discriminatory policies put in place by the federal government. The medium gray have some good, some bad effects. And then the black ones, the dark ones are anti-discriminatory policies. What I really appreciate about this map is you don't see a stark moment when we now have federal policy that is no longer discriminatory. You actually see even contemporary policies, many of them are discriminatory practices. And you can see an oscillation between progressive and regressive policies back and forth. And if you could see the time, they're operating on 4 and 8 year cycles, like our political cycles are. And on the right, images of Levittown. She was looking at how generational wealth, so a family, a white family that would have been allowed to buy a house here because there were racial covenants excluding many people to buy houses in this neighborhood. You could buy a house with your GI money for $8,000. That house is now worth over $500,000. So that generational wealth that family was able to build versus other families being excluded to build, and the effects of that over time. The last topic we'll share with you is systems of injustice. Yash was looking at how many of these Confederate memorials were not just on public land, but on land of state houses and courthouses, land literally where you have to go to the courts if you've got a case. So he started looking downtown around our state house. Other really interesting thing about this data set, because we're in the moment where we're discussing, should we remove these memorials? Should we leave these memorials? Is that the data set is out of date now, right? Because many of these memorials are in the process of being removed. And so we, as Tanya and I continue to this work, we have to get on Google. Is that one been removed? Is that one still there? So that happened a lot with Yash's work. And then here he zoomed back out, not just looking downtown Raleigh, but across our county courthouses. Over 60% of North Carolina's county courthouses have a Confederate memorial on their property. Then looked at the state houses. Every state house in the Confederacy had a memorial, and the number is indicated by the number of rings around that cross. And then he started looking at how many memorials are within 200 feet of courthouses, not just on the courthouse property, but maybe across the street. And started asking questions. What does this mean? What is the value system that's being projected to people who visit these spaces that are supposed to be neutral to them? If in the lawn, as you walk by, symbols of white supremacy are up on pedestals. And I really appreciate the one on the left when he started to look at this stuff, not just from an aerial projection. He started looking at the scale of these monuments in space. So if you guys remember, this is the one that was at the terminus of Hillsborough Street at Union Square down at the State House Capitol. That was 75 feet tall. It was a spire. You could almost see it if you stepped out where the bell tower is and looked down Hillsborough Street. It was in dialogue with the 4 steeples at all the corners, architecturally, all the corners of our State House, you know, the Baptist Church, the Episcopal Church, the Presbyterian Church, the Baptist Church. So he was looking at, as an architect, he was just looking at these symbols of power and the scale of them and how they dominate the space. And on the right, this other sort of retaking of space and reclaiming of space, the tearing down of the monuments in protests that happened. The last one I'll show is Jasmine Carr. She was looking at incarceration and the injustice within the incarceration system. On the left, she was looking at the dark orange is slave population at 1860. So you see where the density of slave populations were at that time, and overlaid it in black dots are modern day correctional facilities, the black and the gray dots. And the black dots are correctional facilities that are predominantly Black population. On the right, looking at correctional facilities across the US, they're scaled per size. And then the states are colored by contemporary Black population density. On the left, again, where are correctional facilities? And then county percentage Black population. And then she started calling out correctional facilities that were actually within the Southern Poverty Law Center's data set, because the naming of those correctional facilities was celebrating generals or slave owners. And on the right, looking at where police stations are as these open dots versus where correctional facilities are. You see a clustering of them, just in part because of where state-owned property is, but it's also concentrated in a Black neighborhood. And then when she wanted to look at these things non-spatially, she was looking at the three sort of zones within our policing and incarceration system. We have policing, we have the courts, and then we have jails. And these thin moments or thresholds to be able to move from one stage to another. And to what she was finding in her research, that more and more people are held before they're convicted within the system in jail for many, many years. And non-white populations, that's disproportionate than to white populations. And then she became really interested in disenfranchisement that happens to felons and those in jail. And she found that there were sort of three levels of taking away someone's right to vote. At the top, you can't vote while you are serving your time, but once you've served your time, you can vote again. So that's about, almost half the states allow for that. And then another half is a little bit more restrictive. If you're anywhere within the system, you can't vote. If you're out of the system, you can vote. So these have to be convicted. These are anywhere within the system. And then 2 states, if you've ever been convicted of a felony, you can never vote again. So those are Kentucky and Virginia. And then she mapped each of those states in relationship to their disenfranchisement level to a percentage of Black state population, that's this axis right here, and then compared it to percentage of Black population in incarceration. So if we just follow Virginia, Virginia has about 19% of the population is Black, but about 49% of its prison population is Black. So she was looking at these indiscrepancies across these systems. So Tania and I had a lot of, well, I don't know if fun's the right word, but the class was really provocative. It got us thinking about how do we understand these systems? How do we measure these systems? How the data that our students were using to measure these systems is inherently biased because of how that data was collected and who that data was collected for. And how it's really hard to map these systems because they're ubiquitous, they're everywhere. And if we try to map racism, it's almost, you can never do it fully. So this spring, we've got a data science academy seed grant through the libraries to look at equity in these different systems and to partner with researchers who are within these fields, within social sciences, within economics, and how they study it and how they understand inequity within their system, so that we can work with them to map them and to propose possibly different sources for data. Through that work, we're hoping to we will hold a colloquium with those researchers that we bring in, and we hope to hold a symposium to discuss inequity, access, racism in the environment. We hope that you guys will join and be a part of that discussion. And we are ready to answer any questions that you have. We got about 10 minutes.
It was great, fascinating work and fascinating visualizations. Okay, we do have time actually for some questions.
Thank you very much. I have a question about some pictures in the beginning where you mentioned the removal of the monuments. So is that picture for a specific time or is a period of time?
When we were showing the four, just the general removal.
Yes.
It was sort of at the moment that it was created, that the map was created. So, 4 months ago or whatever.
Okay.
It was, this is the one you're talking about or the one before it?
Yeah. Where we are.
Yeah. So this is just in 2022. This is the
January
state of affairs. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
There are more yellow dots.
Yes, there are more yellow. They do, the Southern Poverty Law Center does update the data set periodically, but it's not a live, I don't think it's a live update. So we have to sort of go back and check against what we think we know. And,
Yeah, thank you. That was an interesting presentation. I really enjoy the work and I'm very impressed by your students. I'm curious about evaluation and kind of so what and what's next in terms of, have you considered evaluating the knowledge of your students in terms of their knowledge of systematic racism and systemic racism, and how that progresses through this exercise? I'm also really curious about literacy. So obviously, it's, I think, primarily an academic exercise at this point, but then in terms of sharing this form with other populations, with policymakers, and what type of literacy there may be around consuming these maps to change policies.
Right hand.
I think with our students, one thing that was really interesting is that half the students were foreign students. They signed up for the mapping class and they were like, what the hell is the Confederacy? And so that was really interesting. But they brought in just sort of points of how there are similar events, similar things within their history. So that was really interesting. It's just sort of who's embedded in it and who's not embedded in it. I think that the students, the American students that were mostly from North Carolina, knew about this. They knew about Black Lives Matter. They were all white students, but they didn't realize how pervasive it was. And none of them realized how concerted an effort it was to install these in very specific public spaces. And when they started reading the opening lectures that would happen. So every time one of these monuments was erected in the early 1900s, thousands of people would come out and there would be these speeches, and the rhetoric of those speeches is appalling now. And so that was really, really interesting. The comparison between other rewritings of history that happened in the built environment, like the adding of classical details along all of the homes along Hillsborough Street. So the homes along Hillsborough Street, many of them renovated to add columns that looked neoclassical and to sort of ally sort of the wealth and the symbols of that with the South. So all of that was eye-opening to me, I think to Tania, and then to our students. So there was a huge leap. They each, I think, built a set of tools to start to uncover systemic racism, and they were aware of it, but I think we all have a lot of work to do to understand really how do we see these systems, how do we understand these systems, how are they interrelated, how do they interlock. Tania and I just presented a few weeks ago to a professional conference of architects, and they all know all these things, but they don't know them in a nuanced way to actually make changes within the systems. So I think there's a lot of work still to do there. And I think that speaks to your literacy and how does this not live in a class, but how does this move forward and affect policy change?
Yeah, I'll just briefly add on to that too, that I do think that when we were exhibiting the work, there were some policymakers. I think the governor came, and so there were policymakers who were there. I think, like, you're absolutely right. This is an academic exercise, and literally, and for the most part, it's the students who are sort of transformed by this, not that they are necessarily immediately going to go out and have the power to make any change, but we almost think of it as just opening their eyes to this and starting to ask those questions when they do go out into practice about what is, you know, what are we not looking at? Who are we not talking to? Who are we not thinking about as a part of this process is sort of how we come at it. But we also do hope that this colloquium and then subsequent symposium is also going to include policymakers so we can have a more frank.
There's something interesting that happens in these maps too, that because they isolate these data sets and overlay them, they're also really problematic, right? And their oversimplification of these relationships. So there's a bit too of there's a good and bad in the maps.
Are these data sets now available through your course? Like, is this something that our students could have access to for further study analysis?
Sure. So most of the demographic data is census data, and then the Southern Poverty Law Center data set, and then a few students really took a deep dive into archival research around the, you know, the Daughters of the Confederacy, et cetera. So sure, we would contact that student and share it.
Like to check the online.
I guess I have just one quick thing to say. Just how much I enjoyed your presentation, Tania, Sarah. It's really amazing. The examples you presented with the students were powerful, and Tania's opening introduction, I could sense like you were talking about like why maps matter and to this geospatial group, but you did such an amazing job explaining that. And I think sometimes we take it for granted about wide maps and powerful geospatial analytics and things can answer questions, be used also as constructs in addition to truth.
Yeah.
So it was wonderful. Thanks.
Appreciate that. Thank you. The question in the chat, which I can answer, I guess, was I think about the tools that the students used and how much sort of prior training they had, and if there were any alternatives to, I guess, some of the creative suites. So I'll just answer that. And the students have varying levels of familiarity with the person who actually asked the question. They definitely have various levels of understanding of especially like ArcMap. And so we do a series of tutorials. We do offer QGIS, which is a free alternative to ArcMap. Luckily, all of the libraries, as you will probably know, all have these creative suites that have ArcMap on them. So that's great. I think one of the alternatives that to Illustrator, if I can go back, is called RAWGraphs.io, which is a platform, open source, free. There's actually a really good non-geospatial visualization platform. There's tons of different visualization styles. You can really use it, and we try to use it as, as a platform for testing out the way that the visualization can skew the data or make you, take a read of the data that maybe is there or maybe isn't there. So that one in the middle, RAWGraphs, is RAWGraphs.io. It's very easy to get, well, not very easy, but it's fairly easy to get licenses to Tableau, which you may or may not know, which is also a good non-geospatial platform that also has very minimal geospatial opportunities now. I mean, it's not anywhere near as powerful as ArcMap or QGIS, but for somebody who has a steep learning curve, it can sort of stand in for that. But we are in the College of Design. Students are very familiar with the Creative Suite, and they do use that a lot. The reason that we prefer Illustrator over Photoshop is just that it's a vector based, so you can scale up and down much easier. If you go into Photoshop, it turns into pixels. Well, they have smart art, but anyway, it's harder to scale it. And I realize that it's 4 o'clock on the dot.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if there's one other question.
I was just curious, I guess, about the time frame of
the project? So was this something, were all of these projects conducted during one semester? And I guess for future iterations of this class, are you planning on using the same data sets or expanding into other, exploring different problems? Like what is your plan for the future for the course and the types of social issues you might tackle?
That's a good question.
We teach the course every other year. And this was one semester, and the students, as Tanya said, I would say like 2/3 of them came in with 0 ArcMap experience and only Illustrator experience. And so they get pretty far. I think we would like, I don't know that we'll do it on top of the Confederate memorials. We might find another, in our research this spring, we might find another very overt symbol that we want to overlay with these social systems. I find in classes, it's really hard to get students to like build on another student's. They get so invested in the topic that they want to sort of make it fully their own. But I think that, and to be honest, I don't think we do a great job of cataloging our data sets to where they're really easily accessible for all the students. And I think we could work on that so that the data could be shared, not just with our students, but outside of our students, right? So that it starts to be an open source platform for all types of measuring racism in the built environment.
And I would just say, I think both of us have a real interest in built environment and urban development. And so this has been sort of an evolution with that kind of being the thread that has gone through all of it. But I think we're very open to other systems that being designed is like everywhere, right? And so I think we're definitely open to others. Yes, we'd love to hear them.
Okay, thank you all, and thanks, Sara.
Thank you so much.
This was great.
It's a beautiful afternoon. Yeah. Yeah.